The generative in the title was sort of came up with a excess enthusiasm, and I think I blame it on my postdoc. No, we started having promising results, but I think it's probably not quite ready for prime time yet. And so sorry for that build-up and for anyone who's terribly deceived by the title. So I'm going to talk about deep networks for vision, and the plan was, how does that work? Go over a few things. One is a brief introduction to deep networks for vision, object detection, semantic segmentation. So over the summer school, looking for the titles, I see you've been exposed to a bit of deep networks, but I'm not quite sure how much. Do you feel you've been overexposed to deep networks for vision? Not really? Okay, well, I'll go through that, and if you feel you've been overexposed, I'll go through it very fast, and it's fairly overview anyway. The second one is a belief the deep networks alone are not enough. I don't know if there are any strong deep network believers in the audience to start heckling me about that, but it's nice to have a Jan LeCun type to give a counterblast to this, and some of my graduate students are very good at doing that for me. But saying that deep networks work well as components, as combinations of other things, and that they're best when sort of combined with other, perhaps more older and types of techniques. The third one is work more recent I'm particularly interested in, which is trying to get internal representations out from deep networks and to get parts from those. And I understand there's a debate with several people later on about what the brain is doing, and I understand one theme of that might be how precisely things are encoded and things of that sort. Anyway, okay. And so please ask questions, because I guess in the course like this, you're not quite sure what background people have. Okay, so for people like me who sort of knew deep networks, from a long time ago, and remember that in the 1990s they didn't really do anything very much, unless you had a real expert like Jan LeCun hand designing them, in which case they could be quite successful. The ones that came to my attention first were the AlexNet by Alex Kravinsky and so on, and Jeff Hinton, where you took this network, and the network being made, as I'm sure you all know, out of little elementary neural components, and then you glue them together into a structure like this, which has hierarchy, has various sort of components, lots of filters at different levels, etc., and which at the end produces a sort of an output, which for this work was object categorization. So you put in an input image, and you would find within the input image, you'd perhaps localize where the object was and then categorize it as a cat or dog or anything like that. And it's a system that has an immense number of parameters, 60 million parameters weights, which I guess is explaining why these things didn't work in the 1990s, because you didn't have enough data to train them, and you did not have GPUs and things like that to train them, even if you had the data. And so it acts as a very sort of sophisticated type of regressor. And it worked well on the types of data sets that we used to work on, Pascal at that time. Well, it worked mainly on ImageNet, and it was a bit annoying because before that, our group was quite good at doing things on, doing object detection, and then we were just sort of blown away by this more recent technology. And as the way things go, I spent a year thinking, no, we can outdo this technology if we just make our models better, but of course we couldn't. So deep networks of this sort were very effective for detecting objects, which had the idea that at the lower levels you have filters capturing local information. As you go higher up, you get some more sort of abstract type distributions capturing possibly invariance of what's there in the object. I'm not sure how many people understand deep networks, or how many people in the audience understand them. No. It's like quantum mechanics. If you think you understand quantum mechanics, it means you probably don't. But here I would say, but I will say for me, and you'll see this intuition coming out at various times, that I think of a large part of deep networks as doing a very sophisticated form of template matching. Okay, and then the invariant stuff is, if it's done, it happens only at the top levels with the multi-connections up there. And it's, but we'll get into that, particularly when we get later on into the issues of the filters, into the third part of the talk. But in any case, these networks, very effective, and a basic reason why they are is this sort of similarly mundane mathematical fact that the output, the classification, is a differentiable function of the input. The output is expressed as, in terms of all these filter banks. These filters have weights, depend on the input, and you can differentiate the whole thing, which means that if your networks are not, if your weights are not good, if they're not producing the right output, by differentiation you can work out the local direction to improve the weights so that they do better. Okay. However, as part of the theme of saying that deep networks often work best in combination with other things, they often happen in combinations of, at least in the computer vision literature, in terms of having selective attention. That you need to have other techniques which are going to isolate areas in the image where there could be an object. Because otherwise, basically, the deep networks are looking at sort of rectangular boxes and deciding whether this rectangular box is a cat, a dog, or nothing else. And so there are so many enormous number of rectangular boxes you can put in images of various sizes and positions, and even with GPUs, it's somewhat painful to search over all of them. So with selective attention, you can do forms of low-level sort of grouping. You can have queues for edges, and then you can sort of combine them together, group them into regions, and make proposals for where objects can be. And there is sort of, there are other more recent methods, faster RCN, which sort of actually starts training the attention mechanisms as well. But generally, you try and locate boxes, you try and locate positions. Okay, I'll set this up because later on I'll get back to ideas of using top-down methods for doing that. I guess in terms of neuroscience, and I guess Jim DiCarlo gave lectures here, and I don't know exactly what he was saying, but obviously a lot of Jim's work is relating predictions of neural networks or deep networks to properties of the brain. Did he say anything about attention, or nothing really? Probably not. Okay, but I would say, say for computer vision or in general, if you were having the issue, if you're wanting to use one of these models, you do have to have some way of deciding where to store it. And in the spirit of neuroscience, it seems like, selective attention could be based on things that you could do in, say, areas like V1, V2, depending on who you talk to about attention theories, whereas the deep networks would be more imposed in this sort of in the ventral stream and in an area like IT. Okay. So here are examples. I'll come back to a few of these later. Object detection, you get the cat, you get the monkey, you get the potted plant. Actually, that must be a mistake at the top up there. But potted plants are notoriously difficult to find if you're in computer vision. You get sofas, you get bottles, you get these penguins. Actually, there's a mistake on that. And that's setting it up. That should be a bird. Trust me, because I'm going to turn it into a person later. And it shouldn't be a person now, it should be a bird. Okay, it doesn't know what a penguin is, incidentally, but it thinks it categorizes it as birds. Okay, so damn, that was sabotaging myself. But in any case, that's one type of deep network, and so what it is doing is sort of, in a sense, the network is actually abstracting out the details. So by the top level, it says it's a cat. It does not care whose cat it is, my cat, your cat, somebody else's cat. It sort of ignores all that level of detail. And so it's doing a sort of coarse type interpretation of it. Now, another example that we've been involved in is actually doing something quite differently. This is actually doing a fine-scale task of looking at an image and assigning a label to every single pixel in the image. The label will depend on the class, and for scenes, depending on the data set you work out on, you can have sky, tree, road, person, bicycle. Some of the data sets have only 20 classes. Some of them have 880 classes. One we put up said it had about 490 classes, but don't believe it. It has them, but most of them only have a few pixels in them. And so you can do it for scenes. You can do the same method for people or animals. So you take parts. Instead of labeling something as sky, you label it as head or torso or arms or legs or things of that sort. And these things pragmatically work incredibly well. I mean, they work so much better than the methods we had, say, 5 years ago. In fact, 5 years ago or so, we made a data set, and we were going to submit it to a conference, and we ran the state-of-the-art algorithms we had on it, and the results were so disappointing that we felt we could only write the paper as saying our contribution is a data set. The algorithm, no, it's pathetic. It only shows how bad computer vision methods were at the time. But using the deep networks, as you can see over there and over here, you are getting really impressive results out. And I emphasize again, this is a rather different task than just object detection, which is sort of coarsening. This is now going down into detail and doing high precision. These methods, of course, are not perfect. They're still making mistakes, but they are generally doing very well. Okay. And in general, the general result is that you can take deep networks and you can throw them at almost any vision task you could think of, and things go better. So edge detection, border ownership occlusion is something we did recently. You don't just detect the edge, you also know on the boundary of the edge what is the direction across on it. With edge detection, I mean, there are possibly people are claiming, I'm not sure I quite believe them, that you're doing almost as well as edge detection as humans would do for edge detection itself if you somehow could switch off the part of the human brain that knows about objects and uses semantic knowledge. So locally, the deep networks may be using cues almost as well as humans are doing. For border ownership, since we're involved in that, I can state that's not true. We're not doing as well with occlusion organizations as humans, although estimating occlusions, there's sort of local cues for it, but then there's also object recognition, and it's really hard to switch off what role object recognition is playing with that. All you can say is that you can do fairly well with border ownership by a method that doesn't know anything about objects. It just takes data and enough of it and trains it. Symmetry axis detection, that was by Wei Shen. That was something that fell out of fashion in computer vision because it never worked now, and it's not like it works perfectly, but you can get it to work on fairly good data sets. Binocular stereo, Yann LeCun, text captioning by a whole group of different people, including ourselves, who sort of came up with a method at almost exactly the same time, and worked well on that. Depth orientation from single images by Rob Fergus et al., and sort of many more. And the basic rule is that if you have enough supervised data, input-output, you have coding skills, computer resources, and perhaps the most important thing is ability to tune parameters, because these things come out, they're not things out of the box. You have to, if you train a deep network from scratch, you've got a lot of work that you have to do fiddling around with it to get it to work well. But nevertheless, you can get pretty good quality results from it. Now, all these methods, the question of the biological plausibility of it is, frankly, a little bit unclear. There is strong supervision, which is not really plausible. There's backpropagation, which I think is not really plausible in individual neurons, but I believe people can come up with circuits which might allow that to happen. Whether the brain uses them or not, I guess, is a little bit unclear. There has been more recent work. Yeah, question?
You say here that enough supervised training data would kind of get us the objective that we are after, and like so it might. You just also showed those self-sabotage like examples. I'm wondering, even if you have a lot of examples, you would get rid of those, or they're all already there.
Well, actually, the later part of the talk, in a way, I'm almost setting this up. This is a deep network triumphalism thing. And then I will criticize it a bit later on. But still, it's sort of, I don't want to criticize this too much because for a lot of these things, it does incredibly well. But I will later on try and say where I think the limits are and how one can go better beyond them. Okay. So in terms of the, the fact that, when you learn to recognize a cat, your mother is not giving you lots and lots of examples of cats and things like that. So learning can't be fully supervised. There are people like Abhinav Gupta at CMU who do certain forms of learning without full supervision. You can get into debates how much supervision it's happened. For example, one of his work is that you have a system that can track objects. He's not saying where the tracking of the objects comes from. He's just saying you have that ability to track objects. And so you can have a video sequence and you can lock onto some object in the first frame and you can track it up 50 frames or so. And then you can train a system by saying those two things, the object at the first frame and the object at the 50th frame should be the same and they should be different from anything else in the image. So it's not completely unsupervised, but it does it's possibly suggestive of a way that you could sort of bootstrap your way up by learning fairly simple skills first, simple visual skills, and certainly probably tracking and so on is something that may come up very early in developmental literature, and from that you might be able to bootstrap your way up. Having said this, he's got some interesting papers on this. They're not working as well as the full, the methods where you sort of cheat from the neuroscience point of view by having the final, the full supervision, but they're doing reasonably well. So there's potential for using those sorts of methods if you're really into the biological plausibility thing. Okay, so then moving away from this, I should say there were certain things which, and you can't really say never that something can never be done with a deep network, because then maybe someone will turn up with a data set of several trillion examples and a slightly, a different variety of the algorithm, and maybe they can do it then. But several things for which I think the deep networks by themselves are not the most natural thing to do, and you can get good solutions by using them as components. And this sort of gets into intuitions of what deep networks are for, and intuitions are things that you sort of trust until you've got enough evidence that they're wrong. They're guidelines, and so it's not fully clear that mine are correct on this. But the point would be that deep networks are sort of black boxes. Within black boxes, do they represent the objects or the parts of the objects? Okay, I'll give a little bit of evidence later on that maybe they are. But even if they do they make the spatial relations between the object parts explicit or not? If they're explicit, it means that you can sort of switch them off if you don't want them. So if you wanted to detect a person, a man, okay, myself here, you see all of me, you want to find every possible part, every part of me, you need a model that does that. Now I move here, large bits of me are not visible, and a model for detecting me would have to be able to somehow explain away why my bottom part of my body is missing. And it's not obvious that within the deep networks that they've got the capability of doing that. And so I would say the deep networks are good for visual tasks and can be formulated as sophisticated template matching, but they may be less effective in themselves when tasks which involve large spatial transformations, like the pose changes of a person. So you have people standing up. Was that a question?
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I was just remembering a paper where
I haven't seen that particular one. Who are the authors? NIPS last year?
Yeah.
Could check it out. I mean, my first reaction as someone who often publishes in the computer vision conferences is, what data sets did they demonstrate it on? Because the ease of doing certain things there does depend a bit on the data. And as again, I would say with deep networks, you can never say absolutely never something can be done. But I think it's, and there have been attempts to put in certain types of spatial transformations inside the networks, and there's a literature on that. I haven't seen them do things on the hard data sets, or things like that. But anyway, so with a template, somebody standing upright, that's fairly easy. Everybody, when they stand upright, they look more or less the same. And yet here, with these examples, some of which come from this sort of data set of athletes doing things, which means extreme poses, there's a lot of variability between them. And so a standard template would not be able to do this. Well, standard, or even a very sophisticated template would not be able to do this, I would say. But I should perhaps check Nix and see, see what they've got there. What?
I think it was recurrent.
Recurrent neural nets, yeah, I'm quite sure. Yeah, send me it and I can be disproven. Okay, so there, what we did was actually building, going back on the literature that dates back to 1973, which is absolutely prehistoric. I think not even Tommy Poggio was doing vision in 1973, which is that you represent things by parts and you have explicit spatial relations between them. And so here we did work where the parts would be the joints. So here is, I think, Usain Bolt in the previous Olympics. And you would have a system that would try and find the elbows, the wrists, and various other parts of the body by labeling, by just targeting these individual joints and then targeting the configuration. Whether the elbow is straight like this or whether it's at this angle or something of that form. And so the task of the deep network was just to look at regions of the image and classify them as whichever type of joint and at different configurations. And this could be done by just like an AlexNet type or that type of thing. And you do the methods, the results are good. They're certainly, again, they're so much better than any of the previous methods that we'd have for doing that. And in some work with Dan Kirsten with psychophysics, it was suggesting that if humans only have that local amount of information, that humans do better, but maybe not that much better on that. So that's being sort of prepared. And this is something that you keep coming up to sometimes in the deep literature of whether methods are actually at the level of human performance. Usually in my experience, that's not really true, except really boring things like circuit inspection and stuff like that. But it is possibly true for very local things like edge detection without cues, and maybe even for finding certain types of parts. Okay.
What do you mean if humans have only access to this local information? Do you only give it like the small square, or?
Well, in this case here, you'd only give it the small square. I mean, I think the thing is humans are incredibly good at using context. So if you go outside the square, there's a lot of evidence that that is an arm, indeed that it is Usain Bolt's arm. But from that small square, even if you look at that part, there aren't many things it could be apart from an arm. I'm not sure that Shimon Ullman has talked about his sort of atoms of recognition or something, or maybe he's going to talk next week. So Shimon Ullman has interesting results about sort of, if you look at windows of things in images, if it's above a certain size, sometimes, suddenly it starts appearing very unambiguous what it is, and most people agree with it. If it's below a certain size, it's really confusing. So it possibly relates to the fact that humans locally can get, locally, if you're too local, you can't see anything. If you get up to a certain stage of size of the object, you're fairly sure what it is. Okay. But the idea of looking at local areas here, these square things, or in Dan Kirsten's case, you put circular apertures, is that you can just get rid of the context, which for humans would, give us an enormous boost over everything. We can use context far better than than current computer vision systems can. Okay, so you use the deep networks to detect that, and then you go back to Fischler and Nerschlager 1973, sort of called pictorial structure models, and basically the idea is that you have a detector for something. For Fischler and Nerschlager, you had a detector for the left eye, the right eye, the mouth, etc., and then you had spatial constraints that they had to be in certain positions relative to each other. These constraints had uncertainties, and so you had a system for detecting a face which sort of used the local evidence, your ability to detect an individual eye, which in 1973 was pretty pathetic. But if you detected the eye, then it should be roughly, 2 millimeter, I'm forgetting what it is, a certain distance away from the other eye, and it ought to be in a certain spatial configuration with the mouth, etc. So that would be a pictorial structure type model. And there's been a lot more literature developed on that since Fischler and Nerschlager, but you have whole ranges of different types of models where you allow these spatial constraints to give you the context and disambiguate errors that you might make in your detection of parts. So if you put those two together, you did for a long time the Chen and Yuille thing, you were able to outperform any other method, which might be due to the fact that most people were either trying to throw deep networks at the entire project, which I'd say is not so good because these are not really templates, there's a whole lot of configurations, or it may be because people didn't compete on that particular project too much. But also the other advantage of having these sort of explicit representations, it allows you to, deal with cases where things are missing. So here is a sort of a full graph model of the top part of the person, but then you could have sort of flexible compositions of certain of the parts where some of them are missing. And so that's just different types of spatial relations, and you can do inference over those, and if certain bits are missing, then it's not going to mess up your algorithm. And it's very easy to put that in and to be fairly effective on it. Okay. So pictorial structures and parts was one way. Deep networks and grammars, this is another area that you can do. Here with grammars, it allows you to have far richer types of spatial relations and compositions of things. So you think of a person is made up of a human configuration, an upper body configuration. Those are made up of parts. The parts could be shirts, it could be trousers, dresses, things of that. There's a whole lot of combinations that you could put together, and you could have a grammar for doing that. Okay. And the parts also have certain spatial relations. My arm's got to, my lower arm's got to touch my upper arm, so there's spatial relations, but also a sort of a grammar for the types of configurations that can happen. And so you can use those systems where you use a deep network to sort of bottom up to make suggestions that maybe this is a torso or this is a head or something like that. And then the grammar takes those and sort of sorts them out and finds which ones are consistent. Question?
So earlier you were talking about deep networks as a template matcher, but there are other people who talk about them as having certain invariances, like rotational invariance or spatial invariance or translational invariance. Or
Yeah.
I guess I'm wondering, could this be seen as just another type of invariance that needs to be learned by the network, or is that not reasonable for some reason?
I don't know. I mean, I would say with the invariances, I haven't seen them doing any, the ones that are invariant to rotation and things, I haven't seen them doing anything very interesting. They're interesting theoretically. I haven't seen them doing anything interesting on a data set that I think is really interesting. So they'll do things on MNIST or CFAR, if you know those. And but I think, but even so, I think it's good to put that type of thing in. I just can't see how you can put this type of thing in here without sort of modifying the architecture so much that it's so different from a deep network. I think you really have to have the explicit level of representations. There is a certain literature, and Rako Utasan and various other people talk about it with sort of structured, deep structured models, which do have these sideways connections in there, and this, my theories, my ideas would relate a lot to Raquel, what Raquel was doing. Question?
So you don't think that this kind of thing could fall out naturally from like a recurrent setup where like raw or these kind of more generative thing, deep networks, you don't think that you might find a way to get it from that?
I wouldn't put my money on it. It might. I mean, I'll watch the literature, I'll look at the NIPS paper you're mentioning, but yeah, my grant proposals don't say that. Yeah.
Just to get a better sense, so when you say template matching, you mean that there is an ideal image that it is looking for, and that if I cut off the leg, then it's just going to drop the activation because it's further from that particular.
Yeah, right. If that bit is missing, it can sort of discount things, and so template matching, even in the 1980s, you could do a template matching for a face, and even if a reasonable proportion of the face was missing, that didn't affect the template because enough of it was matched. But I'm saying there's a limit to how far you can go with that type of method, I think.
Just because of
Combinations. I mean, you can include objects. I mean, I'll show a few later on. You can include objects by an enormous amount, and yet humans are still going to know what the object is. Yeah?
When you combine these deep networks with grammars, is it like the deep network just initializes the parameters and then you do some type of inference to get the actual relations, or is it like a joint process of?
Well, we've generally done them where they're sort of, in a way, slightly hybrid in the sense the deep network sort of makes proposals and gives score functions, and then you train something which has the spatial relations in them. You can try and train a complete system, which is what, say, Raquel does, and the only paper I've been involved in which does that is one co-authored with her. So in principle, you probably do a bit better that way. Whether you do a lot better, I'm not sure. For me, it's a question of priorities, I think. Yeah.
So if I understand correctly, the main difference between pictorial representation and grammars is that in pictorial representations you have geometrical spatial relation between words, and in grammars you have pools with independent parts.
You could have parts. You could have sharing in grammars. You could have a model for, in one of the cases here, you had a model for a cow where it has a torso, but the torso is the same as the torso for the horse, just whether it's you can share the part. You can have this detector, horse torso, cow torso. It's the same thing. It gets shared between them. The basic elements would be parts. It just gives you a far more sort of richer and flexible way that you can combine between them, I would say, yeah. But you have the spatial representations, you have the parts have attributes. You can just switch them around and do lots of nice things with them, I think, yeah.
And then do you think that for every object and for every task we have like this library of say subparts and things for each of, like for one for cats, one for dogs, one for?
Well, no, you'd like to share them as much as possible between different objects, or else you're going to have a combinatorial explosion of how many parts you have. There's a very theoretical paper I wrote that's actually been published this year, which is sort of trying to quantify that. However, it's quantifying that in terms with a mathematical model of detail. But the issue about how you share, how much you share, really affects the sort of the complexity of the whole thing. Okay.
Who is the author?
Myself and Rosberg Matagi. It's in one of the machine learning journals. But you have the parts, you share them, and also you represent them slightly in a distributed manner, that you have a coarse representational position, which is then coupled to a lower, more precise, low-level configuration of it. So anyway, that was, the complexity problem is something that worries me when I'm in my mathematical frame of mind. If I'm publishing in computer vision, not many people are going to care about that at the moment, because we're nowhere, we're not there that yet. But I think in the long term, and I think for neuroscience, it's an important issue. Okay, so I think sharing is an important thing, and it will come up again. Okay, so you have the parts and so on, the grammars. And another thing I wanted to put in here again was sort of attention. So there was selective attentions. We said that you have methods for trying to find places where objects could be, so you don't have to search over all of them. And here was a sort of an example of things we did which included sort of top-down attention. So suppose you are doing semantic segmentation of the type I described a little bit earlier. There are some problems with it. It performs badly for small objects. There are reasons for that, because semantic segmentation algorithms are rewarded by the percentage of pixels in the image that they label correctly. And if you have a small object, there aren't many pixels in it, and so the algorithm has no incentive to do much better on it. Nevertheless, also, they're obviously harder to detect anyway because they're smaller, there's less evidence for them. And so what you'd like to do is you'd like to take the bit of the image where there seems to be a small object and sort of just blow it up. Or conversely, if you have an object that's enormous, you'd like to sort of take that bit of the image and blow it down to do it. And so, and the second problem comes in with, even with some of the models I mentioned earlier, if you have lots of people standing together, which of course you frequently do because we are social animals, you'll find that there's interactions between them, and you'll start mixing up the elbows of one person with the elbows of the neighbor and stuff like that. So the idea of having sort of a top-down attention thing, that while you're trying to find the parts, you have a more holistic model of a human, that sort of makes proposals in the image where humans could be. And if you have those proposals, then that gives you some idea of the scale. It also gives you an idea of the likely positions of the parts. And it sort of works, I guess, not as well as human performance, but it improves over the models I've shown you. I think it's a part of the component that you probably have to have. Here is zooming, and I don't know how clear those are. These are better answers. It works for humans. It also works for animals as well, not surprisingly. And over on the right were sort of examples of models. If you took the one that about detecting the parts with the one with the Usain Bolt picture and the parts, which I guess I was so proud of a year ago. This is the sort of error you're getting on it in those situations. But now, if you use the sort of top-down attention to give you a sort of an initial suggestion as a person here, person here, person here, then you're now getting fairly good results out from that. So at some level, these are sort of possibly computer vision sort of games, but they also really relate to human knowledge. We know that, well, I don't know if we know that humans are looking for parts in images, but there's certainly evidence that they could be using top-down models there's a lot of evidence for top-down attention, which would be priming using object models of humans and things like that. And so it's interesting that when you put them into these systems, they work well, and they do solve certain problems which you want to get solved. So deep networks as components, I think deep networks well as components, parts having joints, spatial relations, pictorial structures, grammars, things like top-down attention. And I guess I already was asked the question, can these all be done by an end-to-end network with enough things inside it? I guess my answer is I'd like to see it before I believe it, but maybe, but I think it unlikely. Neuronal plausibility, which I get asked sometimes on this, is that the models, as far as I know, there's nothing really neuronally plausible about a deep network compared to certain other types of models. There's a basic McCulloch-Pitts thing of, linear summation of weights and things, which was a model in 1944, and real neurons, from everyone I talk to who works on real neurons, say they're a lot more complex than that. It doesn't mean that they can do anything by any means, but there's sort of a range of, one shouldn't perhaps restrict oneself too tightly to some of the things in the artificial neural network literature. And so if I'm worried about this, I talk to my friend Tyson Lee at CMU, and he sort of reassures me that he thinks these things can be done, or at least there are basic components for it. Maybe that would be a good topic for a debate sometime. Okay, so they're all neuronally plausible, but does the brain know that? Which I think is an old joke from Tommy when I used to be a postdoc working with him. You can think of all wonderful things that you could do with neurons. Okay, so now I get on to the next part of the talk, or the third part of the talk, where I want to talk about deep networks and representations. And so if I've been saying that parts are really good and deep networks are really good, does that mean that deep networks have parts? And I guess the answer is what I would say here is that there's sort of evidence for what we do and some other people at MIT do, that the answer is somewhat yes, although I would say they're not using parts in an optimal way, even when they have them. Okay. And I want to bring up occlusions because I like occlusions, particularly if you believe in parts, occlusions are a nice thing to have data sets on, because if you have, the idea would be if you have occlusions, if you occlude objects enough, and this already came up, you could probably screw up a lot of models based on templates. I mean, templates can deal with certain amounts of occlusion, but they can't do with enormous amounts. And so here are examples from my students, and so this is where I'd shot myself in the foot by giving that penguin as an example where the penguin was mistakenly labeled as a person there. And here are examples where you can turn the penguin into a person by giving a TV set, a bicycle, a motorbike, or a sofa. And you don't have to just do this with penguins, you can do it with cats. So that cat on the sofa, which before was a cat, you give it a motorbike and now it's a person too. You can do it with a bicycle. And then this monkey in the jungle, right, you give it a motorbike, you give it a bicycle, you give it a guitar, and it becomes a human. Interestingly, also the guitar becomes a bird. And I think there are sort of reasons for this. Again, these are deep networks, you don't know why they're doing what they're doing, but the idea that I would have is when the deep network is giving training examples of humans, say, giving examples of humans, humans are interacting with the world, and there could be bicycles near them, or motorbikes, or TV sets near them. And the deep network is given this large rectangular region that's going to have those things in it. So the deep network is somehow exploiting the context that appears in the data set when you train it. And it's never seen penguins with TV sets, I assume, never seen cats with motorbikes or monkeys with guitars. So it sees that, and that overrides it. I mean, obviously, it doesn't hurt that the cat is standing upright. The penguin looks a little bit like a small human anyway, and the monkey is also standing upright. It needs that sort of information as well. But it's like it's taking a certain amount of context, which is there in the training set, because it's given this rectangular box, and if you screw up the context, it starts screwing up the network. And so my explanation for why that guitar is considered a bird is it's never seen a guitar in the jungle. Its training data set of guitars have been, in people's houses or on stage. And so here in the background, there was jungle stuff, and so it looks a little bit like a bird anyway. So, okay. So the thing is, you can sort of screw up perception of the deep networks, which is a moving target, of course, because deep networks get better. They have more layers, they have more examples, but you can screw up ones at any stage, I think, by putting in certain forms of occlusion. Okay. Okay, so occlusions and parts, and so we started making this data set because I'm sort of a believer in parts, and it seemed that, that deep networks would, that looking for the whole object would start failing on parts, and that would be an example of, that would make parts even better. Parts would be more robust to occlusion than object models. And of course, parts are needed for every other reason. You don't just want to find a car, you want to find the door handle, you want to find the key ring, you want to find all that. You have to find the parts at some level anyway. And it's just my belief that you probably want to find a lot of that while you're detecting the thing, rather than sort of finding the car and then finding the pieces afterwards. There was a compositional argument. That's the thing I mentioned earlier about that. And then there was the part and occlusion thing. Okay, so now though, having said occlusions are interesting and they can mess up deep networks, I now want to go away from that and then get back to the issue about what deep networks do, and are there any internal representations of parts inside them. So deep networks are good most of the time. Parts are important, so maybe they've got them inside them. And so there was work from, I don't think Ord was the first author on this, but there was work from Ord Oliver's group where you take networks, train them on certain things like scene detection, and then maybe objects or parts would drop out as the activity of individual filters. And there's other work by Rob Fergus and other people. Our idea here was that maybe one should look at the population activity of neurons, of the filters, rather than just the individual neurons, and to do this on very specific objects and to do a very serious analysis of it. So you take a deep network trained on ImageNet, AlexNet or VGG, doesn't really matter, and then you give it a lot of examples of cars or airplanes, buses, trains, bicycles, motorbikes, or things like that, and you then compute the feature vectors at the neural network at different layers, and at each layer you can just cluster the responses. So at each position in a deep layer of a neural network you'll have 512 filter responses, or 256 depending on what you use. And so at all that level you'll take all those filter responses and you'll cluster them together, and you'll then do k-means or some clustering algorithm to see which calculations of feature activity happen very frequently. Okay. Yeah.
Can I just quickly ask, earlier you mentioned as well that with, given a high quality enough data, a deep network might be able to do a whole range of tasks. In the case of this, for example, in the case of the images that you just showed us, do you know if it's true that our data sets are biased towards having less occluded images, or do you think that with a larger data set with more occlusion, or for example more guitars and more places, it would become less biased to thinking that the monkey is a person?
Yeah, I mean there are several points there, all of which are good. Firstly, yes, the data sets are biased. You can do experiments. I think Laurent Itty's done some experiments where you train the system from one viewpoint you do not recognize from the other viewpoint. We take things that have been trained on this big ImageNet data set. For some viewpoints of some objects, they recognize it 100%. From other viewpoints, they recognize it with 0.1 AP, which is pretty bad. These are sofas. And these are things that a human would look at it and would say it's a sofa. So certainly the data sets we have, even though like ImageNet, they're incredibly big, are not really well controlled by the standards of good quality control thing, even with viewpoints, I think. Then when you're talking about occlusion, my argument to that, and this again, this becomes more belief than anything else, is that there are just so many ways you can occlude an object. I think the complexity of it can sort of, could kill you in the sense, or kill the deep network. I mean, if you have limited amounts of occlusion, sure, they can do it, and they already are doing it. But I could occlude an object in an exponential number of ways, and with an exponential number of patterns, and I think it'd be a very clever deep network that can do that, and training it with large amounts of data, I'm not sure. I sometimes think we ought to, I keep saying to people in the group that maybe we ought to do that sometime, because somebody's going to ask us that questions. So,
in that last case, you mean even for a case that would be easy for humans, like even a case of occlusion that humans could handle?
yeah.
Yeah, deep nets wouldn't necessarily.
Well, I mean, they won't at the moment. There's a bit of psychophysics we've got there. But whether they could be made to do it, the thing is, you'd have to keep training it and training it and training it and training it. There are, and so I don't know. Anyway, yeah.
The combinatorial explosion that you were talking about. So, I mean, even if you think about pixels which are beside each other, and you consider the combination of pixel arrangements that can be, that's exponential, but at the end of the day, deep neural nets are able to learn the surface that like natural images or sceneries are lying over that, right? So, like, with such an argument, I would say maybe, so I'm not an advocate for neural nets, but I'm just saying that such an argument might actually be the reason that thing you could be able to get rid of occlusion at the same time.
I'm not sure, and actually I wouldn't agree with your first premise, which is that networks can learn the patterns of intensity. Because if you look at some of the work that people do, showing, there were ways to break deep networks, and I've only shown the one we did with occlusions, but other people at Cornell and other places have shown that you can learn deep, you can start off with random noise stimuli and just sort of have a stochastic gradient thing on that, and you can get it classified to be a cat, and it looks nothing like a cat. And but one reason they can make it look more like a cat or whatever you want to classify it by is putting in certain image statistics that people have been finding on natural images for ages, sort of Simoncelli, other people. There were sort of basic properties that happen in images, histograms of gradients and so on. So if you have to put that in addition to what the deep network's got. But anyway, that's still just perhaps a quibble on your first point. But you know, but still, I would say I doubt that. You know, I think it may ultimately come up to what's the easiest way to do it. And I think you could brute force try and throw deep networks at it, and somebody is sure to do that, which is why we haven't bothered to do it yet. But I think there will be simpler ways to do it, which will be as effective, I guess. Question? Oh, that was what I was meaning by the order liver paper.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, so that was, yeah, I mean, sorry, I know Order's not the first author on that. I just think of it as the Order paper. But yeah, that was the idea where the things would come out. So I'll get to that, or at least not to that particular paper, but to see what the individual neurons would encode. But my point is, even if the deep networks are encoding parts either by individual neurons, as in that work, or by populations, is what we're suggesting here, they're not sort of necessarily doing the smartest thing with them after they're encoding it, I think. So anyway, here is the clustering. So it's sort of very basic. You just sort of cluster things, you combine them together. And then because you've clustered in the feature space, for every point in feature space, you've got an image patch that sort of generated those features. So you can look at all the image patches that corresponded to that cluster. And the thing that you get out from that is they are incredibly similar. They look very visually similar most of the time. Not always, because some of the clusters are bad, because you're using a k-means clustering and it gives you sort of pretty a few bad ones. But you do get pretty clusters where, for example, at pull-free lesser, you get a tire, another tire, as being things that correspond to the same visual concept. You get these things of windows, of airplanes, you get bikes, you get noses and things like that from it. We're doing it in a case that's actually a lot easier than what the MIT group, Tarablo and Antonio and Ordis and people did, because we are sort of normalizing the object. So we're taking a bounding box around the object, which is of roughly the same size. We're not trying to do it on the full image, where objects would appear at different sizes, and I think populations would be harder to find. Anyway, these are the sort of things you should get, but you should not be impressed by that, because people were getting these things with single neurons. And my response was, okay, I see the top 3, but what's happening with the other 5,000? Because okay, I could get lucky with 3. And so then what we did was that you looked at indeed things like the top 100 or 500, and you just picked random samples from the top 100 or the top 500, and they all look fairly similar to the ones that you get in the top 5. Also, then you do things like you run an edge detector over your examples, and then you just sort of average the edge detector. And if they were very variable, the average of the edge detector would look sort of almost, would look really bad, but in some cases it actually looks fairly good. Then you can do it with the image. You take the image that's assigned to it, you average over it, and you get that sort of structure. It looks like it. I mean, admittedly, in the spirit of computer vision, I'm showing some of the nicer examples, but in answer to the reviewers, we even had a web page where you could go on and look at these for 176 types of these things, and some of them are nicer than others, I'd admit, but a lot of them are reasonably good. You could even, on some of the nicest cases, you could even do principal component analysis, and then you could sort of generate things out like that. And possibly my talk title with the generative was thinking we'd be further along with that generative process than we actually are now. But nevertheless, what I would say here is that you do find that the populations of neurons do seem to encode fairly nicely. So here would be the top 6 first 6, and then random 6 from the top 500. And there's not a hell of a lot of difference between them. Then the average, the edge mean, the edge image, and you are getting reasonable number of things out. You're having a little bit of trouble with things like the license plates with the edges, because the edges are not going to be quite overlapped. But overall, you're getting something which says there's a black thing there and a white thing at the bottom. Okay. Right. So that.
What layer?
These were layer 4 of the network. If you go down, they become smaller and less distinctive. If you go up, they're sort of a bit similar to this, so they've got larger sizes of this. Okay. And just to give a representation of what you get, wheels, they like wheels. Wheels are very nice patterns. Actually, you'll find the individual neurons actually get wheels too. But for some of the others, some of the other things there that you're getting out, you're getting doors, you're getting door handles and things like that coming out too. Yeah?
Sorry, just to make sure, when you say individual neurons, you mean convolutional neural network?
Individual artificial neurons in convolutional networks. Yeah, the Antonio odd paper. Yeah. Oh no, they're real neurons as well, I'm sure. Yes. Who knows? Yeah. Okay. So then you want to quantify these more. Okay, it's one thing of saying, hey, these are nice, gee whiz, these look good. So then you try to do it to see, well, would they fit key points? Maybe actually I should skim over part of this because I realize there's been so many questions, time's gone on a little. You try to do it, okay, let me just keep the first part really short. You do it for the key points which are labeled on these things, and they do look like they find the key points, but the key points here, they're only labeled, they're rather sparse, they're not really capturing things very much on it. You don't have key points on airplane windows or anything. So you can show things are reasonably nice, and you can show they actually work better for these things and as detectors and things. But then you decide to go on to be the serious, we've got to go on and to annotate the data set. So you take something like a car and you put a whole lot of parts on it like this. We call these semantic parts. We have something like 39 semantic parts for cars. I'm not sure exactly where 39 comes from, but that was, that's what is happening. So now here are examples of the semantic parts. On the car itself, we're not showing all of them because otherwise it's too messy, but here is semantic part 1, semantic part 2, etc., up to semantic part 39. So these are all labeled on our data set. And then the task is to say, would these populations, so the populations I'm calling a visual concept. So we're having 176 visual concepts that have come out from this clustering algorithm, which visually look like, some like tires, some like doors, some like other things. So what we do several types of tests. We try to see, for each visual concept, does it like any particular semantic part? By liking, it means if you take that semantic part and you compute its feature vector at that level, is it close to the feature response of the visual concept? Because the visual concepts are obtained by clustering feature vectors in space. So a visual concept would be defined by a particular set of neuron activities. And so when you get a filter response, is it close to that activity? If so, you can sort of build a detector out of it like that. So you can try and build a detector for the individual visual concepts for detecting the semantic parts. They do fairly well. Then you can allow several of the semantic parts to combine together to detect the object, to detect the semantic part. Okay, so we define the semantic parts. The deep network produced these visual concepts. There's no reason that there should be a one-to-one correspondence between them, and in fact there isn't. And also you'll find that if a semantic part is a tire, you get a visual concept that corresponds directly to the tire, but you get one that corresponds to the top part of the tire and a bit of the metal above it, or one that corresponds to the bottom part and a bit of the metal below it as well. So all of those visual concepts also can be useful for detecting the tire. Question?
You get the sense, or maybe this is an experiment that somebody could run, that the parts which are detected by the neural net are actually easier for humans to recognize as well. Because one can imagine that semantic parts are functional rather than representational.
Right. I mean, these are really, these are imaging patterns. Yeah. and the semantic part is a bit more of an abstraction out there, which could be described in that way. Sometimes they're the same. I mean, the tires, they've got such a clear thing. On other ones, it's not really clear. I'm doing, it could be experiments on that. We're doing trying to get some experiments going with Sujin Park at JH, on some of those things. But if anyone wants to do experiments on this, let me know. There's a number of things to work out on. But then the idea, though, is that several of the visual concepts are sort of capturing part of the, they are overlapping in a sense. They're not exactly on top of each other, but, one's on the tire, one's top half of the tire, one's on the right part of the tire, etc. And so you could think you could get a better tire detector by just taking all those and combining them together. So to combine them together, we're using a very old-fashioned technique, which is sort of log likelihood probability ratios. You have probability of response of one if something is there, and probability of response if it's not there. You take the log likelihood ratio, that's the evidence, and so you just combine the evidence together. You have a set of visual concepts just sort of acting there, and then some of them get grouped together and give you evidence for detecting a semantic part. Okay. So very simple things. The answer is if you do that, you actually get, for certainly like cars, not for all of them necessarily, you get very good you get pretty good detectors. So for something like a car, for the easiest things, which are the wheels, you're getting a detector that's performance in terms of average precision is sort of almost up there with at least a last year deep network for detecting the whole car. Faster RCNN, which was one of the methods. It's not exactly a fair comparison because we're sort of doing a particular task and faster RCN was trained on doing a related task. But you are getting fairly high up in that sort of towards that, with just detecting the tire by itself. I'm not saying you couldn't do this in another way. You could just throw a deep network for detecting a tire in itself anyway, and you'd get it out. But the ability to detect the parts, I'm surprised to see quite how effective they are. Combine them together with a sort of simple method of voting and stuff like that, where you have votes. Each visual concept has a vote for detecting the semantic part. You average, you sum these up. The only possible interesting thing there is the vote is negative, you get rid of it. Vote is negative could be negative evidence, so it could mean that filter doesn't like it. But since we're obsessed here with occlusion, it could happen because part of the tire was occluded, and so one of the visual concepts is screwed up, and we do not want that to kill off the other ones. Okay. So anyway, there's a little bit more detail here, but maybe I'll rush over there. Here, and results of visual concepts, you're getting things of AP of this form, which are really quite high. Fast RCN on this was the state of the art a few months ago. Now there's a better thing out from China we'll have to compare with. But we're getting that sort of results out just for tires alone using this method. Okay, back to occlusions. So, the occlusion data set is partly invented because I believe in parts, and parts show up. It's a way to show that parts are important. And you can take these objects which are in the in this data set, and then you can superimpose objects in front of them just by sort of taking cutouts and sticking them in. I think they don't look terribly realistic, but they don't look completely unrealistic either. And the question is, and you can vary the amount of occlusion, you vary the number of occluders, you vary the percentage of the object that's overlapped. And as you increase the number of occluders and the amount overlapped, the deep network starts failing. It's not too surprising. And again, it's not fully fair because it was never trained to do that. On the other hand, as we discussed earlier, to train it to do that, you'd have to train it on an enormous amount of data, and you don't know if it could do it. And the bottom line of this is that you can put in lots of occlusions there, and humans, and this was some psychophysics done but not published, humans can still recognize the object, even under these amounts of occlusions, but the faster RCN cannot. As for the part detections, the parts obviously it's easier in a way for detecting parts than it is detecting objects, but you can still detect the car wheels with reasonably good performance even when a very large amount of the object is occluded. I mean, as I say, that's not too surprising, but this data set was really put up to make that point. You can detect the parts when lots of the rest of the object is hidden, and where humans at least can still say that they know what the object is.
Are you using relations between the parts of audio?
Good point. No, we are not, because there were various bugs in the code that slayed it down. Yeah, it's something we're obviously doing. We're concentrating at least on getting the individual parts detected as well as we can. You can make improvements as we're getting now with detecting the combinations of the parts, but that's not really ready to talk about. But that would be, that's the point of the next stage. I mean, with this case here with the car, with the wheel and the back of the car, well, if you just see the wheel by itself, you don't see the back, you might think that was just a wheel by itself, but a human, you're seeing the top part of the roof and part of the window, and you're sort of reasoning that they're roughly in the right position. And as a human, you may also have to have in your brain a sheep detector, which detects a sheep and explains why that part of the car is missing. And so, again, that's sort of a part of the reason why I'm not sure that deep networks or their current strategy are enough, because there are these phenomena like explaining away. If you know all these wonderful experiments by Knizia and things like that, you can see an object, and if you can explain why a bit of it's missing, then you perceive the object. If you can't explain why it's missing, you can't. You don't really perceive it like that. And I can see how to put that, mechanism into a sort of a grammar model very easily. I can't persuade myself that a deep network of the current form can learn how to do that. Yeah, question.
My intuition might be wrong, but when I look at images like this, I tend to think that maybe the relation between the positions of, say, the wheels and the windscreen of the car, for example, are features that might help me recognize that the car is there in the first place. And this kind of spatial relationship, I mean, I'm not sure how you would encode that into a neural network. I guess maybe that's also what you're saying, but it also has a combinatorial problem, right? Where rotate the car and there are just so many positions it could be in, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, that comes up a lot in the current work. I think the spatial relations between them, sort of like if you do a graphical model, you have a node which is an object part there or something like that, you've got spatial relations, an awful lot of things going on in there. It's an NP-complete problem and stuff like that. But my take on that is probably that we're in a regime with these detectors that the unary terms in the graphical model only have a few possible examples, possible things. There's only, if you look very locally, there's only a limited number of possibilities. If I look at that car window locally, the car tire, I know it's a car tire. And I don't know many other places in the window are car tires. The thing at the back, okay, that's a little bit less clear. There's a window, there's a metal roof. I'm not sure of that, but the fact I can detect the parts with, I have a limited number of parts that I can find, limited number of false positives. Sorry, I have part detectors that have very few false negatives, a limited number of false positives, and then I think I can deal with the potential combinatorial explosion of the spatial relations. But that would sort of be roughly the idea. If at a certain level, and this relates to possibly the Simone idea that, certain level I'm almost sure that I found it bottom up, or I found enough of these things bottom up, then I can check with the other things. Even with the grammar models that I mentioned earlier, the grammar models to do inference over all the possible configurations of the human, if you do that exhaustively, that takes, I don't know how long, well, 40 seconds, which isn't that long, but on a generation that's used to deep networks, that's sort of infinite. But you prune them, and a lot of the configurations you never have to consider because the bottom-up queues are so strong that those things never really matter. And I think it's quite clear with humans that if we have cases where the bottom-up queues are not strong, like the classic Dalmatian dog thing, the Dalmatian dog with the patches, the first time you see it, it takes ages for you to see it. After that, you store it in your memory and you can see it immediately. But I think if the bottom-up cues are below a certain threshold, it's going to take you a long time to find them. And in computer vision, we're nowhere near the ability that we're going to have to deal with those problems yet. There are harder problems to deal with first. But for human perception, I would think that a lot of the time, the bottom-up cues aren't good. And there are plenty of animals that their whole lives are based on the fact that camouflage works very well, and you can't detect them. But anyway, it's that's the complexity issue, which is right. It's coming up there. Anyway, so I think I'm almost done for the alpha. Here's the occlusion detection. This is just a table, and I don't think the results are ideal, but it's just showing that the deep networks, well, with limited amounts of occlusions, you put more occlusion, the deep network starts degrading fairly badly, but the performance of the tire detection works reasonably well. Okay. And yeah, Sujin has done some initial experiments unpublished saying, okay, we give them these images that the deep network can't do it, but humans can still recognize the thing. Okay, so summary, of this part, the summary of the deep networks, the sort of evidence here that, at least for some of these objects, that they have internal representations of parts. There was the MIT thing, and actually in the bit I skipped over, we did a little bit of comparison. You can use the individual neurons. You do better if you use the populations. It's not really surprising. You've got more data in them. I'm far from convinced that we're doing the populations in the best way that we can, but I think and there may well be better ways of doing it, but still seems like for these objects, at least, you are getting nice, nice parts sort of inherent inside the network. I would say these objects have been particularly chosen as being rigid objects. If you try and do this with a human waving their arms around, you may not get such nice clustering things in them. You may have to do other things that we're thinking about. Coding by individual neurons or populations, and I should be citing other people in this. And perhaps citing Aude in this particularly because I gave a talk on this and she was in the audience and I hadn't cited that work at all. I just mentioned it, so I'm a little embarrassed. Okay, evaluated by testing them and showing that if you use them, they're actually quite useful, and if you combine them together, they're quite good at detecting parts, and they degrade gracefully as the objects come in. So then the full overall summary, overview of deep networks for vision, that was the first bit, saying deep networks are really good, then saying I'm not sure they're good enough, and that I think you need parts, pictorial structure, grammars, top-down attributes. And then the third thing was sort of partly attempting to understand what's going on inside the deep networks and then trying to see if you could use certain of the abilities of deep networks to do better, which is an ongoing project. Okay. The final thing at the bottom is a shameless advertisement that if anyone is interested in projects on medical image processing using deep networks, see me because I need to recruit people to work on a project like that. So if you know that or any friends who have that, there's lots of interesting things to be done using these methods to look at CT scans of interiors of objects and recognize tumors, and do early detection of cancer on something. So it's a little bit different from studying human abilities, but it's I'm looking for people to do that. Okay, otherwise that's it, more or less. That was an edge detection example. This was a text captioning thing. And maybe I'll leave you with the one about deep networks can be fooled.